Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this fall's Business Journalist in Residence program. My name is Marianne Vernetson, and I am the Interim Director here at the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. The Business Journalist in Residence program is a partnership between the Warrington College of Business and the College of Journalism and Communications. We invite leaders in business and economic reporters to UF to meet with students, engage with researchers, and present their expertise, and tonight is no exception. This evening's public talk, hosted in collaboration with the Graham Center and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, will explore the critical global issues of trade and tariffs with our guest, Peter Goodman of the New York Times. His reporting has shaped how we understand the forces driving the global economy and focuses on how public policy decisions and global market trends are experienced in our communities. We're especially excited to partner on this program as the Graham Center celebrates our 20th anniversary. For 2 decades, the Center has prepared students for careers in civic engagement and public service, and tonight's conversation reflects that mission, bringing together students, faculty, and community members to discuss complex issues. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge our partners from the College of Journalism and Communications, along with colleagues from Warrington and class. It's wonderful to have you in the room. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's program, Elizabeth Inswasti. Elizabeth is a senior majoring in history and media production. She is a former Graham Center Global intern and recently completed the WLRN International Journalism Internship, where she reported on stories at the intersection of immigration, Latin American politics, and Florida communities. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marianne. Yes, the WLRN internship was an amazing opportunity. If you have any questions about it, I'm more than willing to answer it after the talk. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Goodman, tonight's speaker. Peter is the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, where he has reported on the top economics stories of our age, from the rise of China as a superpower and the 2008 financial crisis to the ongoing trade tensions between the US and China. Peter began his career as a freelance reporter in Southeast Asia before joining the Washington Post, where he covered the dot-com boom and later served as the paper's Asia economic correspondent in Shanghai. He then joined the New York Times in 2007 and has since served as its European economic correspondent and contributor to the Times' global economics coverage. Peter is also the author of the best-selling book Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, and How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain, which overlaps nicely with his talk tonight about the reemergence of place in global business. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Can everybody hear me? I had to flick on my own microphone. All right. And thank you, Marianne. It's a real delight to be here. I did have the occasion to speak with Bob Graham a few times in the course of my career, and it's exciting to be in a building named in his honor. I don't always travel in such cushy circumstances. I'm not always dressed this way. A couple of months ago, if I can get this slide up, I was in the cab of a tractor trailer for an entire day, working its way through northern India from just outside of Delhi to Jaipur. And you may wonder, why was I in the cab of a tractor trailer? I had hours to ponder that question because it was 105 degrees. That's 41 degrees or so for those of you who think in Celsius. There was no air conditioning, and every time a breeze managed to penetrate the cab, it was like a gift from the gods. And every time we hit something on the road, which was frequently, my head would hit the steel bunk on which the driver would sleep when he wasn't behind the wheel of a car. But I actually did have a good reason to be there. I was doing a story, or a series of stories actually, on whether China could maybe be replaced, or at least in the margins, production of goods that we rely on here and around the world could be shifted to factories in India. And that was prompted, of course, by Trump's tariffs on China in his first term, which Biden then continued and advanced. And of course, now we're in a whole different level of magnitude of trade war and, of course, the chaos of the pandemic. And as I pondered this question, and looking at the animals in the road and families full of people stuffed onto motorbikes, I did wonder, is the infrastructure really up to it? And I remembered at one point I was chatting with the driver on one of our many tea stops along the side of the road. I said, I noticed you're driving very slowly. He topped out at about 25 miles an hour, and he said, yes, look around, there are cows, there are people, the roads are not so good. What's the hurry? I thought, well, I lived in China for 6 years and spent a lot of time in different parts of industry in China, and the number of times I heard someone say, what's the hurry, was zero. So I was already somewhat dubious that India could step in for China in terms of the future of the global economy. And then, of course, more recently, Trump put 50% tariffs on imports from China, and so much for that whole story. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because there is no exaggeration that we are living in a historical inflection point. I think probably every human being who's ever walked the earth thinks that their time is the most fascinating, volatile time. But we're really in this moment where it's just very difficult to predict what's going to happen next. I've been writing about economics on and off now for 25 years. I've always felt that I had some sort of overall grasp of the story, what rules were in place, and that's just no longer the case. I think most economists, if they're honest, will tell you that there are so many variables that forecasting, or even just getting a sense of the frame with which we're supposed to analyze what's happening in the global economy, it's bewildering, quite frankly. And just quickly, we've got, of course, the Trump tariff war, which has become a global phenomenon. We've got climate change, which is both an existential threat to us as a species and an incredible business opportunity. Let's face it, the green energy transition allows us to rethink almost every aspect of our economies. We've got this decoupling between the U.S. and China, the world's two largest economies, going supposedly, not really their separate ways, but at least diminishing reliance on one another. We've got labor on the march, which means that working people are getting more of a piece of the action. It also means that we're more likely to have strikes at places like ports. And we've got a whole host of geopolitical variables, including disruption of global shipping, as the Houthis fire on ships that are headed toward the Red Sea off the coast of Yemen, which has basically shut down traffic through the Suez Canal, which means that ships moving between Europe and Asia have to go the long way around Africa, which adds cost. That's just a sampling of what we're dealing with. That's a lot to deal with all at once. So in my time up here, let me try to give you just a few key points to keep in mind as we try to make sense of what's happening to the global economy. First and foremost, place is back. This fantasy that we have lived through for most of our adult lives, that a factory in Bavaria or central Ohio is the functional equivalent of a factory in coastal China, as long as there's container shipping, as long as there's the internet to allow communication. They're all the same. It's just part of one great web. That's broken down, and place is back, and we're now reckoning with the risks that were there all along. Just in time, which we'll get into in more detail later, this idea that we cut inventories to the bone and rely upon the internet and container shipping and global supply chains to deliver what we need in real time, that has to some degree been supplemented by pressure for greater resilience, just in case, if you will. And the distance is shrinking. There's pressure on companies that make stuff to shrink the distance between their factories and their customers, but cool it with obituaries for globalization. Globalization is not over, it's changing, it's going toward more regional trade blocks. And finally, flexibility, this idea that whatever is most efficient has given way to flexibility. Flexibility is the new efficiency. So let's unpack that in some detail. For most of our adult lives, we have pretended that there are no risks in this mode that we've been living through, that we can depend upon these supply chains that go across oceans, that I'm not demonizing. globalization has done remarkable things for us in terms of opening up markets for exporters, giving us consumer choices, improving standards of living. But this idea that this was like frictionless and risk-free, that's broken down. This was a lesson that was personally hard fought. I was living in London during the first wave of the pandemic, and my wife and I, we had our third child born on April 8th, 2020, in the middle of lockdown in London. And I had to leave the hospital after an hour. My wife was stoic about that. She was stoic about the fact that her parents couldn't fly into New York to help with the baby. She understood that we couldn't go see the pediatrician because the pediatrician's office were closed, which involved I actually have to administer shots. Not good for marriage. I don't recommend that if you're thinking about it. And she was okay with all of that till finally she said, well, we should, this is, way before vaccine. She said, we should figure out how to get a good stash of sanitizer. We've got, Amazon people coming, bringing the stuff that we need. And I went out and looked for sanitizer, couldn't find any. We looked online, couldn't find it. Okay, let's make our own. All the ingredients that we needed were gone. I walked all through North London, couldn't find any. And my wife looked at me and said, well, you're supposed to understand this. What on earth is going on? And I didn't have a good explanation. And that the answer to that basic question became my book. The end of the let's pretend that there are no risks in this traditional mode. And of course, I wasn't the only person having this experience. Collectively, we figured out that wherever you sit on the political spectrum, it's not a wonderful idea to have the brains of modern manufacturing, computer chips, concentrated on one island that happens to be 90 miles off the coast of China, a country that not incidentally claims that island, Taiwan, as part of its sovereign territory and has threatened to take it by military force. Maybe we should spread that around a little bit. And at the same time, in an era of extraordinary polarization where, let's face it, there's almost nothing that our two major political parties agree on, but one that they do seem to agree on. And I'm not here to tell you that the merits are correct, but I am here to tell you what you already know. The one thing they agree on is that we're supposed to be treating China as our rival, and we're supposed to be diminishing our dependence on Chinese industry. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like, but that is driving not only policy, it's driving decisions that businesses are making. And at the same time, businesses through the pandemic had to deal with the fact that the container shipping industry is an unregulated cartel. And there's a lot of history there we can get into if you like. But during the pandemic, we saw the price of moving a container full of goods from Shanghai to the west coast of the United States. I mean, the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are the gateway to roughly 40% of the imports reaching us by container. We saw the cost of moving one container full of goods go from about $2,000 to north of $25,000 in a few months. And that's for the simple reason that while, if you decide to go book a shipping container for some reason, you will discover that there are literally scores of options, but the carriers are organized in three basic alliances, sort of like your airline alliances, your Star Alliance, your One World, what have you. And those three alliances dominate, 90+% of the traffic where it really matters, which is Asia to the west coast of the United States, Asia to Europe. And they are positioned whenever there's a shock to the system to rip your face off. Now, my book traces one container that was moving from a factory in Ningbo, China, to the port of Long Beach in Southern California. And I follow the first ever order for a company called Glow that's based in Mississippi, run by a wonderful guy named Hagen Walker, who went to Mississippi State, was an engineer, came up with this kind of novelty cube idea, these light up cubes. You drop them in a cocktail glass and they would light up, and bartenders liked it because it sort of punctuated their cocktails, and they could look down the bar and see who needed a refill because the light went off. And then somebody wrote to Hagen and said, my child is autistic, and bath time has been an absolute nightmare between the rushing water and the confined space. And then we dropped one of these cubes in the bath, and our child was transfixed. Well, this became a product in its own right that's now leading the company. And I tracked the first shipment of Elmo-themed bath toys made from these glow cubes from this factory in Ningbo, China, to Hagen's warehouse in Mississippi, and looked at all the things that happened along the way. And they span from not being able to find plastic in China because the Chinese government quite sensibly said, you know what, making ventilators, that seems like a more important thing to do than making Elmo-themed bath toys. And then at the same time, a lot of migrant workers decided to stay home rather than come back from the Lunar New Year, and so it went. Factories were shut down. And then when Hagen decided to book a shipping container, he discovered that the prices were up wildly, and then when he finally got one, he ends up in the mother of all traffic jams. 75 floating ships, some container ships, some tankers, just waiting for their chance to dock at the twin ports of LA and Long Beach, because by this time, so much stuff was moving across the Pacific to serve us all in the pandemic that he barely made it for Christmas. My book tells that story. And I think part of what that story illustrates, which is useful forward-looking, is that economists do the best they can, but everybody got the pandemic wrong. Businesses got it wrong, economists got it wrong. The assumption was, okay, we've got this pandemic. We've never seen one of these before. None of us have ever lived through this, but it's going to function like your usual economic downturn. People are quarantined, therefore we're not making as much stuff, and so we're not going to consume as much, and let's not make as much in anticipation of the drop in demand. And that's why we had a shortage of computer chips. That's why we had a shortage of so many things. And what actually happened, as we'll of course recall, is that while it's true that we weren't going to our offices, so the local sandwich shop wasn't getting our business, and we weren't sending our children off to school because school was closed, in many states at least, we still had to entertain our children. We still had to cook for them. So suddenly we're at home making 27 meals a day, where we can't go to the gym. Now, if we have a basement, we're putting a Peloton in there. And we order all this stuff, and it comes across, a lot of it from Asia, across the Pacific, and it overwhelms the works. And that's really, in large part, the story of how we ran out of so much, why I couldn't find hand sanitizer in London, why I'm sure many of you couldn't find all sorts of things that you remember. But there's another element to this, and that was another point on my takeaway slide, which is we overdid it with just-in-time. Now, just-in-time manufacturing was a very sensible idea pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War. And Toyota recognized, they couldn't operate like Ford under Henry Ford, where they just made as many cars as possible and let salespeople figure out how to sell them and distribute them. This is Japan post-Second World War. Capital is constrained. Industry has been decimated. Japan is very mountainous. There isn't that much developable land. They had to be more efficient about it. So Toyota figured out we should treat our inventory the way a grocer treats milk. You want just as much milk on the supermarket shelves that nobody leaves unhappy that there's no milk. But you don't want so much of it that you spill a lot of it at the end of the day because you had too much of it. You make as much as you need to replace what you've sold. And this is a brilliant idea, and on the strength of this idea, Toyota becomes, by many measures, the most successful automaker in history. And then along come, I happen to pick on McKinsey in my book, but you can pick on any consultancy you like, the consulting class working for the executives of publicly traded companies who are obsessed with what they view as their fiduciary responsibility to make their share prices go up at all times. And McKinsey construes this just-in-time idea, or lean manufacturing, as, tell you what, corporate CEO, here's what we're going to do. We're going to liquidate inventory. We're going to take the money that we used to spend putting inventory and parts in warehouses as a kind of insurance against the bad things that inevitably happen in life that are unexpected, and we're going to take that money, we're going to give it to you, executive, as a reward for being smart enough to hire McKinsey. We're going to give it to your shareholders in the form of dividends. They're going to love that part, and your share prices are going to go up even more. And, what could go wrong? Things could go wrong, but with any luck, by then you'll have cashed your options and you'll be on, a beach somewhere lifting a cocktail from a hammock. And so that overdoing it with just-in-time manufacturing sets us up for the shortages of the pandemic. And this idea, by the way, spreads to other industries. So the railroads, which did a very poor job grappling with that surge of inventory that came in to the West Coast, had their own version of just-in-time. It was called precision scheduled railroading, which sounded really good. It basically meant fire lots of workers, cut service to the bone, make trains longer than ever, which meant that any accident now actually became dangerous and hard to sort out. But shareholders will love it. And the way they made shareholders love it was they said, Wall Street, we're going to lower dwell time. Dwell time is the amount of time that cargo sits in any particular place. And they said, buy our stocks on the basis of how well we do lowering our dwell time. And this was, as I argue in the book, a kind of fetishizing of efficiency to the point that it became wildly inefficient. And I'll give you my favorite example. So I found a railroad engineer who was based in Idaho, working for Union Pacific, who discovered that he was regularly, this is not an outlier, regularly transporting cargo to the wrong destination. And he was doing this because somebody running the Union Pacific rail yard in Nebraska had gotten the corporate mantra, oh, we got to lower dwell time. That's what we're all about, lowering dwell time. We work for the shareholder. And I don't care where the next train is going. I'm attaching as many cars as I can to that train and getting them out of here. I've done my job. I've lowered dwell time. And this engineer discovers that he's pulling auto parts that are supposed to be going to Southern California. Well, they're going to Washington State. He's got drums full of chemicals that some paint manufacturer in Northern California needs to make paint, and, well, they're going to Oregon. And at a certain point, somebody's going to have to turn that stuff around and send them back to Idaho or Nebraska to be rerouted back to where they're actually going. So there are customers who need this stuff. There's somebody trying to replace their brakes, and they're being told, oh, we don't have any brakes. We don't know when this stuff will come in. There are couples bickering over why they can't get the color they want to finish their kitchen renovation, and their marriages are already not in great shape because of the pandemic. And, you know, this kind of inefficiency is a direct outgrowth of this efficiency as propelled by shareholder maximization, because, you know, at the end of the day, Wall Street and publicly traded companies, they live on return on asset. And if you lower your inventory, you have reduced your asset, and whatever revenues you've got to divide by the asset, they look bigger. So your return on asset, which is a ratio, looks better on paper, but all through the system is lots of inefficiency. And I remember at one point I talked to a London Business School professor who said, yeah, you know, the problem is that if you need to make a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic and you can't get the stuff that you need to make a ventilator, you don't get to say, well, at least my share price is high. But that's the world that we were living in. So what do we do with all this? So we've overdone it with just-in-time. We've overdone it with reliance on cheap shipping. We've pretended there are no risks in the system. We shrink the distance. Not always. I'm not saying global supply chains are bad, but I'm saying resilience is required, and in some instances, we've got to have a backup plan. We've got to shrink the distance between the factory and the customer. I've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years in Nuevo León, Mexico. Monterrey is the capital of Nuevo León. It's a border state. Happens to be very, very good at getting foreign direct investment from around the world. At one point, I met a group of South Korean companies, suppliers to Caterpillar, the construction and agricultural equipment giant. Caterpillar has a factory in southern Texas, and I'm meeting somebody working for a company I've never heard of, based in South Korea. I said, why are you here? Well, we're thinking about setting up a factory here. Oh, how come? Well, Caterpillar's basically said they're tired of hearing that our inventory is stuck on some container off of Southern California. They're worried about shipping costs. And they've flat out told us, you either get within 5 hours of our plant in Texas by road or rail, or we're going to find some other supplier. So here we are in Monterrey, Mexico. Now, the wild card in all this, of course, is our president, who has decided that it's not enough to rely on Mexico, we need to make everything in the United States. And there's no safe harbor, we keep hearing from the president and Peter Navarro, his chief trade advisor, who really seems to believe this, that, if we're not making it in the United States, you're going to hit tariffs, that's how it's going to be. And the problem, as anyone running a global business can tell you, is that a lot of what we're moving across the water now, or across borders by road or rail, is not finished goods. It's the piece parts of industry. You make a car, 30,000 parts could go into a car, and some of those parts, our auto industry has been developed in the context not just of NAFTA, but now the USMCA, which Trump himself negotiated in his first term, said it was the greatest trade deal in history. Well, the auto giants have invested all this money and made decisions on the understanding that these borders effectively don't matter if they're tapping the North American supply chain for their goods. So we live in a world where if you want to make a car in North America, we've got parts that sometimes cross the border with Mexico alone, maybe 8 times in the course of one little piece, gets a chemical treatment here, it gets sent over to the other side of the border to be attached to something else, back and forth it goes until it ends up on a finished car in Mexico that probably has 35 or 40% of its value stuff that was actually made in the United States by American workers. So if you mess around with that flow and you say, well, everything's got to be made only in the United States, you are actually putting American companies at a disadvantage competitively to companies that can still tap the global supply chain. That said, there is some reshoring underway. I spent last week out in Phoenix at the Taiwan Semiconductor construction site. Taiwan Semiconductor, which is absolutely the most important player in computer chips, they make the most advanced chips. Apple's their customer. They're making chips for NVIDIA, ending up in data centers for AI. They have promised to spend $165 billion building 6 fabs, 2 advanced packaging plants. This was started by the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration. The Trump administration has sort of rebranded it. They're not into grants. There's more, we can get into this in the Q&A if you like, more of kind of a Chinese state-owned enterprise model where they get to decide who gets what, but they're this is the industry they're really in favor of, is semiconductors. And so in areas where we have some version of industrial policy, there is real momentum to bring industry back to the United States. And I think it's fair to say that there is some reality to this idea that that's a national security imperative. But we're not going to be making our T-shirts in the United States anytime soon. And if we do, the robots will be getting the job. So this idea that we're going to make everything back in the U.S., it just doesn't stand up. Moreover, in the uncertainty that we've got over the trade war, everybody I talk to in business says, I'm absolutely not going to borrow millions of dollars to build a factory in the U.S., not knowing how long these policies will last, knowing that if I do that and the trade war disappears, if some other president comes in, circumstances change in some fashion, I could be competing against some other company that's again tapping the Chinese supply chain or the Indian supply chain or whatever. I want to pause and note that trade is good, and we should remember that. And this backlash that we've got to trade has a lot more to do with our own failure in our own country to cushion the blow for people who lose jobs in the face of trade or technology or whatever. Not every country is coursing with hostility toward trade and demonizing trade, demonizing immigration, looking for reasons to blame some externality for the downgrading of people's living standards. And of course, people's living standards have been downgraded, and there are places that we're all familiar with, in industrial places in the U.S. that have suffered quite dramatically. And I'm not here to diminish that, but I am here to say that's much less a function of trade than it is, how we've decided to apportion the bounty of trade and how we've decided to basically abandon people who have been sitting in harm's way. But trade is good. I like my blueberries in New York in the middle of winter. If we didn't have trade, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. We'd be out, catching fish or figuring out how to grow food. And globalization is not going away. I would give you this understanding of what's happening. Walmart, largest retailer in the United States. If you are a manufacturer of a product and you hope to get it on the shelves of a Walmart superstore, you got to fly into Bentonville, Arkansas. It's like going to see the Pope. They don't go to you. You go to them. And 15 years ago, if you flew into Bentonville and said, here's my refrigerator, my spatula, my lawnmower, whatever it is, they would say to you, where do you make your product? And if the answer was other than China, you had a problem, because the assumption was you couldn't possibly be getting the lowest possible price, you couldn't be making it at the most efficient scale. Well, now when you go to Walmart, you have that same conversation. I want my product on the shelves of your superstore. Where do you make your product? If the answer is only China, you have a problem, because they want to know, well, what's going to happen if there's another pandemic, if there's some other disaster, if there's a war? Where's the backup plan, so we're not just waiting for some container ship to show up? The trouble is that in this time of trade war, there's really no safe harbor. So, again, I was in that truck in Mexico because India was looking like a pretty good potential alternative to China, and at the moment we got 50% tariffs on India, and that's a function of the fact that tariffs in the Trump administration have now become instruments of far more than trade. We know, we got 50% tariffs on Brazil because Trump's unhappy with the prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro, who stands accused of fomenting an insurrection to try to overturn a democratic election, which, as Trump is not fond of that particular narrative, feels allegiance to Bolsonaro. In the case of India, my colleagues reported a couple weeks ago that Trump opted for 50% tariffs on India because he was unhappy that Narendra Modi, with whom he had such a special relationship, that Modi came to Houston for a Howdy Modi rally, and then Trump went to India for a Namaste Trump rally, and they embraced and held hands. And well, that relationship seems to have soured because Trump thought that Modi should support his bid for a Nobel Peace Prize for solving the India-Pakistan crisis, which last I checked hasn't actually been solved, but that's a small detail in this narrative. And that was not tenable for Modi, so now we have 50% tariffs on India. That makes it very difficult to plan. So we don't have access to the global supply chain domestically. We just had a raid in Georgia on a Hyundai plant that exists precisely because of these incentives to get everything made in the United States. And now we have people working for Hyundai in South Korea saying they're never coming back to the United States. That's a lot of volatility. Mexico, we've had threats of auto tariffs, we've got steel tariffs, a lot of uncertainty there. We just talked about the limited value of special relationships, which brings me finally to, we've got to get our minds around this idea that old form of efficiency, efficiency still happens to be a good thing, but the sort of mutant version of efficiency that created rail cars pulling stuff to the wrong place, or warehouses so lean that we could run out of medicine in a pandemic and discover that 90% of the basic ingredients for certain medicines are made in one country that we happen to be having a trade war with. Like, that's got to go to something much more sensible, where we think about backup plans, we think about resilience. But even companies that have done a lot of that are now grappling with the uncertainties of the trade war, which is why we have to fear a certain amount of growth stagnation. A few weeks ago, I was in Louisville, Kentucky, at a factory that makes footwear for Keens. You may know they're kind of weird-looking water sandals, and they make utility boots, and they have a global supply chain. They were very early to get out of China. They've got a factory in the Dominican Republic to take advantage of much easier shipping lanes there. They had a factory in Portland, Oregon, but suddenly it became hard to hire enough people there. So they set up this new factory in Louisville, and it seems like a sensible move, but as I was there, they were grappling with the fact that they can't get cardboard packaging to put their products in, so they were bringing it in from Cambodia. At that moment, they had a 46% tariff on goods, since lowered on imports coming in from Cambodia. They had a factory in India that was making the uppers. They were trying to figure out, what do we do with the 50% tariffs from India? So here's this company that was ahead of the game a decade ago, before the Trump trade war of the first term, before the pandemic. They were already thinking, we need to think about resilience and spreading our investment around. And, they're hanging in there, but they're grappling with volatility that is going to require a kind of permanent mentality of flexibility. I think I've said enough for the moment. I appreciate your attention. It's wonderful to be here, and I look forward to your questions. You want me to sit over here?
All right.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk. There was a
Thank
lot
you.
of interesting stuff, very relevant to today. My first question is, how do you see these changes in the global supply chain and flexibility versus new efficiency affecting consumer products and our individual buying habits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't put a lot of stock in the idea that consumers are going to save us. We're busy, right? We're doing our jobs. We're raising kids, taking care of older relatives. We don't. I think to the extent to which we as consumers think about place, that's to the good. And I think the old cliche that we should try to support our local businesses is, more useful than ever. Though it turns out, from an emissions standpoint, it's actually, if you're thinking just about climate change, which I didn't talk about much here, is more complicated, and sometimes there's lower emissions by going with giant operations. But basically, I don't think that consumers are going to suddenly become supply chain geeks. It's happening in the margins, and we know those examples. I think it's going to take companies and government action. And I think in terms of companies, the thing that I would have gone harder on if I were rewriting the book now is that there's a real divide between the publicly traded companies and private companies. And so there are some, the largest publicly traded companies, Amazon, Walmart, Target, they had enough money that they could actually charter their own container vessels in the middle of the pandemic. And they have enough money that they can sort of place their bets across the table. So, Walmart, I actually don't know what Walmart's doing since the 50% tariffs on India, but at the time I went to India, they were planning to triple their sourcing from India by, I think, 2027, up to $10 billion. And they can afford to do that. But Hagen Walker, the guy with the glow cubes, he's one guy with 27 employees in Mississippi. He can't charter a container ship. And he actually tried, my book ends with, he tries to diminish his dependence on China, and figures out that he just can't do it. He showed me an app that he uses to source in China that's sort of like an Amazon window, where it's like, look, if I need to buy some type of electronic component, I can fire up this Alibaba app, and I can get 20 bids in 15 minutes and read reviews of these suppliers, and I can interact with people on WeChat in English 24/7. If I tried to do that in Vietnam, which, by the way, we also now have tariffs on, or Cambodia or India, it would take me months just to identify the suppliers. So there's a lot of sort of gravitational force to those supply chains in China. But I do think private companies that don't have to answer to shareholders who will go after them if resilience involves spending more money and hurting the next quarter's earnings, they have more freedom. And I never know, the public companies I talk to, like I've spent time with Columbia Sportswear, Keen's, I never know how representative they are of everybody else, because they're willing to talk to me and tell me their stories. Target doesn't invite me to go rooting through their filing cabinets.
Thank you for that. I'm also curious about how these changes in trade agreements are going to either widen inequalities between developed and developing countries. How is that going to affect the economic status of all of these places?
That's a great question. I really worry about the developing country development playbook. Because, you know, in our lifetime, or before a lot of the lifetimes of those of us in this room, you know, we had an export-centric, industrial policy heavy development model that lifted a lot of people out of poverty. I mean, you go back to South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, where they start with labor-intensive goods like, you know, sneakers, clothing, furniture, and then they climb up the value chain, and middle classes have emerged from that. China took that playbook to, you know, a place we've never even thought about. I mean, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, and then, you know, into the first part of the millennium with the so-called tigers, mostly in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, tremendous improvements in living standards. Well, all that's dependent upon export markets. I mean, if we have a, you know, we're having a trade war. And a lot of those countries, if you look especially at Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, they send a lot of their exports to the United States. So they're losing some access to that market because this idea that it's really just about diminishing dependence on China, that seems to be no longer true. At the same time, China's got its own domestic problems, the overhang of a catastrophic real estate bubble, and a need for growth, which involves turning up its own exports. And China's been incredibly resilient in continuing its exports, which involves sending more and more goods around the world. So, you know, China didn't have to compete with China. Indonesia does. Thailand does. Bangladesh does. So that's a real problem for developing countries.
Thank you. And kind of on that same vein, the current immigration changes that are currently happening in the US, especially with the H-1B visa policies that Trump is doing, how do you see that affecting manufacturing here and like the factories and global supply chain?
Well, I think that combined with the fact that we've decided to abandon the green tech transformation does not bode well for our future in advanced manufacturing. I mean, it's healthy that we're serious about semiconductors. That's the one part of advanced manufacturing, and I guess biotech and AI, of course, that are serious. But, you know, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is an existential threat, and the rest of the world is not following us off the cliff. I mean, the American model now seems to be, you know, hi, would you like to buy some LNG? While China's everywhere now with cheap solar cells. Pakistan is now installing more solar capacity than any country in Asia after China. Wind power, huge in Europe, in places you wouldn't even expect. I mean, the Philippines just scheduled their first offshore wind auction. And so this idea that, you know, we're going to double down on fossil fuels while also making it harder for the best and the brightest around the world to come here to help do our work. You know, I mean, I guess, look, I'm an NBA fan. You know, if we decided, like, you know what, Giannis Antetokounmpo he's stealing a job from some American player. You know, how good would the NBA be? You know, if we took that approach. But that's essentially what we're doing in business and academia.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really well said.
Thank you.
I will now go ahead and turn it to the audiences for any audience questions. To our online viewers who are watching on the YouTube live stream, you can go ahead and post your questions in the chat, and our moderators here will go ahead and read it out for you. So does anyone have any questions?
We actually have an online question before we open it up to the audience. Eric Hamilton asks, closer economic ties were often pushed as a way of reducing international conflict. Is there a greater risk of conflict if we soften those economic ties?
Yeah, that's a great and really important question. And, you know, I have to sort of back into it because I tell the story in the book. Part of the reason why we're in this moment where relations with China are so toxic politically is because of how our own politicians and business interests sold China's entry to the World Trade Organization back in 2001. So this is both political parties. I mean, Bill Clinton ran as a presidential candidate against George H.W. Bush, accused him, of coddling the butchers of Beijing after the Tiananmen massacre, said things would be different in his own administration. He would focus on human rights. And then, not even a decade later, he's at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, which happens to be across the street from Tiananmen Square, saluting Jiang Zemin, the then premier of China, and literally picking up the baton and conducting the orchestra of the People's Liberation Army Band as he lobbies to get China into the World Trade Organization, something that he's doing because it's good for Walmart, which is in his home state, and other retailers. Not that that was bad necessarily. The bad part was telling everybody that the more we did this, like we're not doing this for Walmart, we're doing this because once the Chinese people get a taste of Kentucky Fried Chicken, they're going to demand the ballot box. The more they trade, they're going to be more like us. And so this is magnanimous. It's about freedom. Well, we know how that story played out. It's played out with China becoming increasingly assertive on the world stage, arguing with some justification that its own economic power should translate into a greater say over the rules of the global economy. And meanwhile, China took the money that it raised through entry to the WTO and becoming a manufacturing powerhouse and doubled down on education, on infrastructure. Now, let me pause and say, I'm not apologizing for human rights violations in China. I'm not saying there wasn't corruption and inefficiency, but in the main, they took the money and they invested in building out more capacity to make more stuff and eventually get into innovative areas. We took the money and we gave most of it to Jeff Bezos. I mean, that's what happened. And so a lot of people are really angry about that. And so now we live in a world where trade, at least in our own country, has been poisoned. Okay, so that's my very long preamble to this good question. That said, the Clinton people, while they were wrong to not deliver the policies that shared the bounty more equitably, were not insane to conclude that when countries trade with one another, they are less likely to pick up arms and try to kill one another. And we know, if you go back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, which turned into a tit-for-tat global trade war, which certainly did not help us avoid World War II, that these stories tend not to end happily. I'm not here forecasting that we're going to have a world war, but you mess around with a global trade war and downgrading people's living standards, and the pressure is going to go somewhere, and it's going to be expressed somewhere. So I think it's fair to say that living in a time of trade animosity is not helping us in terms of our security.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? I saw one in the back. Yes.
You just mentioned two things. Trade war is the word you've been using a lot, and you mentioned Smoot-Hawley, and you noted that Smoot-Hawley was tit for tat back in the 30s. That doesn't seem to be what's happening now. It seems to be just us at war with everybody else. Can you project out, I can't project out, how that's going to play? I mean, it seems to me that somebody else is going to benefit and they're going to get into other markets.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing now. They're looking for other markets that don't have these problems.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, first of all, Smoot-Hawley played out at a time when there was much less trade. We could be much more self-sufficient. We weren't dependent upon global supply chains. So yeah, I think you're right. It's a very different world. I mean, we have seen retaliation from China. We've seen threatened retaliation at various times from Canada and Mexico, Europe. Now we got the deal with Europe. We'll see how long it lasts. But I think you're quite right. The geopolitical implications are many. And to see, for instance, Modi now embracing Xi Jinping at a summit, these arch rivals, I mean, they're enemies. And when you talk to ordinary people in China and India, they'll tell you that they feel animosity toward the other power, yet they're really kind of natural allies in a lot of ways. The world's two most populous countries, they understand something about what it's like. I mean, only those two countries know what it is to try to organize something at a scale of 1+ billion people. There are a lot of resources they could share. There's no, the companies that I visited in India that are reeling with these 50% tariffs to the U.S. because they built their factories, they borrowed money, they hired people on the understanding they could make stuff for Walmart in the U.S. They're scrambling to construct markets in Europe. If they get those markets, that's going to be the market. Meanwhile, certainly China is aggressively stepping into the void that the U.S. has left. I mean, we invented the solar cell in this country. We invented the semiconductor. We should be dominating wind power. Well, if we're not going to do that, we're going to play in a space that Russia is just as strong in as we are. I mean, not in the aggregate in terms of oil and gas, but that's Russia's model, right? Like fossil fuels. Well, China's stepping in and making affordable solar cells that are in Africa, South Asia, Latin America. So certainly the implications will be different than Smoot-Hawley, but the nationalism and the animosity and the rivalry is there and could ignite in ways that are very difficult to predict.
Thank you for that answer. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. Really enjoyed it. In light of all of that you presented, can you offer any insights on implications for agriculture and agricultural trade?
Sure. Agriculture is also subject to some of this flux. I mean, you've got soybeans, major crop in the United States that should be getting exported to China. I mean, the processing equipment in China is set up for the type of soybeans and the way in which we send them over there. Well, China's now actually investing capital in shifting to Brazil and Argentina. And again, once those supply chains are in place, they're going to be hard to displace. And we know that if the market is smaller and there are transportation costs to account for, you know, if we have a glut of commodities that used to move across the ocean that are stuck here, well, the price goes down. And we've seen this, you know, in almonds in California. We're seeing it in grains. But, you know, the other thing, this is not entirely related to your question, but I can't resist telling you, is I think that our thinking about trade is now so poisoned by these nationalist ideas that I will share with you an experience I had in Louisville, Kentucky a few months ago, where I'm at this distillery, taking a tour of the distillery, and the young guy who's showing us around says, you know, for this to be Kentucky bourbon, it's got to be 51% stuff, you know, made here. And he says, well, you know, here's the corn that we get from some neighboring county. Here's some other grain that we bring in from Ohio. Oh, here's rye that we bring in from Canada. And some guy behind me says, why are we bringing in rye from Canada? And the guy says, well, it's weather's good, the price is good, it's, you know, we got a trade agreement, we can get it. Well, how can you call it, you know, Kentucky bourbon if you're bringing in rye from Canada? I says, well, I'm American. The buildings here in America, the people who work here are American. I mean, have we really reached the point where you can't, you know, get a grain from a fellow English-speaking democracy over there? And I asked the guide, I said, how often do you get that question? He said, a couple times a day. So I just think like this stuff is penetrated deeply, and that's going to have consequences. Thank you.
Very interesting how that's going to play out. I saw a question over here.
I can speak. First of all, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask, because a lot of these issues with like sort of trade war stuff has kind of come from both the first and second Trump presidency.
Right.
Sort of how does like the global trade market look like post-Trump, and like will these regionalization like sort of trade trends continue, or how do you predict?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, it's very hard to imagine how this whole thing ends, when it ends, who knows. But I do think that the consolidation of kind of regional trade blocs in place of wherever I can get the thing I need, I'm going to give them all my business, and that's typically China, and I'm just going to count on that. I do think that for many companies, that's over. And so Chinese companies are increasingly looking to Southeast Asia. Western Europe is increasingly looking to Eastern Europe and Turkey and North Africa to a certain extent. And we are increasingly looking to Latin America and the Caribbean, in the main, with a lot of exceptions. But I tend to think that as companies are forced to consider options that they didn't realize they had to contemplate before, they'll actually realize savings. I mean, I went early this year to Colombia with a Minnesota-based medical supply manufacturer, medical device supplier. And this, by the way, is a private company. So they have the freedom to do whatever they think is most sensible for their business. They don't have to answer to, Dan Loeb or Bill Ackman or some other activist investor. Why are you wasting money on some factory in Colombia when you could just make everything cheaply in China? And so they moved production from China to Colombia, which has been kind of an adventure in its own right, but they've discovered that, it's actually quite cheap to ship their goods from Cartagena, Colombia. There are worse places to go on assignment than Cartagena, Colombia, and to the port of Savannah. And so they're not going back. I mean, Trump could declare, that China's a free trade zone for America tomorrow. They're sticking with Colombia, and they're looking to the Dominican Republic. They like the idea of being close. And I don't think that force is going away anytime soon because we've lived through this crisis. We've lived through the trade war and the pandemic.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So
Great question, by the way. Thank you, guys.
Hi, thank you for your speech today. And my question for you is, how do you see the shift in dependence away from Asia, especially China, affecting inflation and cost of goods to the end consumer? And also, does the shift in dependence change global consumer demand?
Excellent questions. Tough question to answer. I'm going to weasel out and say, well, it depends. Does it tend toward inflation? Yes, absolutely. If we go from an era when we just take the lowest price at all times, pretend there are no risks, then except for the times when there's a crisis, we are getting the cheapest stuff most efficiently. And if we go for more resilience, that involves more cost, which I would look at as a form of insurance. But the part of this that you have to reckon with, and that I reckon with in the book, but we haven't talked about here, is corporate concentration, competition. And in industries where there isn't competition, then the companies can easily pass on the cost to us. And we know that greedflation is real. It was sort of laughed at by a lot of clever, wonky think tank types in Washington as like being really naive, but we can now see it in the earnings reports of companies. They've said the quiet part aloud. Like if they're able to pass on the costs and then some, and this is, for instance, what happened in container shipping. Like container shipping figured out like, oh, people being really nervous about whether they can find space on one of our ships, that's pricing power. They'll pay extra to know that they can get space. And the same goes for every good. So if there's competition for our good, then maybe the resilience turns into diminished margins. Although even there it's complicated because, you could see your Amazons and your Targets saying, well, all right, we'll just drop the cost lower. We'll let our competitors get wiped out. And then one day we'll have more of the market and we'll jack up prices then. So long-winded answer, important question. In general, yes, inflationary, but with a bunch of complexities in there. You guys asked great questions. Elizabeth did a fantastic job, and I really am grateful for it.
Thank you so much. So with that, give a round of applause.
Thank you.
And I believe that concludes the Peter Goodman talk. We do have a slight reception up in the second floor, so in the reading room area over there, if you guys want to stick around and maybe ask any questions you weren't able to ask during the panel.
Delighted.
So, thank you.